inevitably, as you get older and you acquire the sort of the trappings of having been around, you actually become less willing to take risk. And so new churches are actually more willing to say, we'll try and reach this group that others have felt not connecting to at all. Third, new church planting often has a dramatic effect at renewing personal discipleship. I don't want to overrate this and suggest that this is the silver bullet, but it is remarkable to me when I see people join new church planting teams, how they reconnect and enliven their discipleship. And rarely does that have to be told that that's something they need to do. People that get involved in church planting often deepen their personal and corporate commitment to prayer. They're usually more diligent and generous in their financial giving. They become more diligent and active in sharing their faith, more regular in their attendance of services and small groups. They generally give more of their time and are often more actively involved in helping and enable others to do that. And it seems just like it's an intrinsic sense that if we're going to be starting this new community, then everyone's needed and everyone's contribution is vital. You'll know in your church, you will have some people who are very involved and contribute and give in all sorts of ways. You'll probably know lots of people in your church that you think they just attend and they're sort of ticking over. And there's something about the call to be involved in the apostolic mission of the church, and perhaps to go from something that's a bigger, comfortable, self-contained unit to something that's smaller, that's, will need to grow and will need to reach other people, that it sort of just reactivates faith that's within people and stirs them up. Now, there is a minority report with that and a concern that needs to be highlighted, which is that also being involved in the leadership of church planting can take a higher toll on people's well-being. Higher instances of dropout, of burnout, of moral failure, of substance abuse, and even of apostasy. And I wonder if partly that's just because we haven't learned enough about how we support people who are, in a sense, putting themselves on the front line. Paul himself's an example. He gives his own testimony about I've been flogged, I've been shipwrecked, I've been rejected by the church, I've been cold and hungry. He lists the pressures that went with the role that he accepted. And I think as much as I want to be enthusiastic about encouraging people to be involved in this kind of ministry, there's also a sort of there's a pastoral responsibility to make sure we're not exposing people to something that they're not ready for. And sometimes people aren't ready for the thing they desire to do. They need to do some more work in their discipleship or in their character, or build a network of supporters, or whatever it might be. They need to build some of that up before they say, now I'm going to go and do this, and accept that there are going to be some actual additional pressures or challenges that go with that. Fourth, church planting methods can revitalise declining churches. And actually in the UK, most of what is called church planting at the moment is actually revitalising existing churches. That actually has meant church planting as a movement has been more positively received, because actually it's benefiting the church that we have inherited responsibility for, rather than saying we'll ignore that, we'll just start new things. That's a much harder proposition to make, certainly within an institutional church. And so the methods of church planting actually, I think, fit best to that type of intervention where you have a church that is imminent to close or has closed, and you want to sort of bring it back to a fresh life, a bit like a restaurant under new management or that kind of thing. And that has a lot of benefits. Often you pick up the latent connections that are in the community. Remember the story of St Peter's? Everyone wanted it to close except the local community who didn't go to the church. And I don't know what happened to them, but I know that church grew rapidly. I wonder if actually they got what they asked for, and they were drawn into a church that they petitioned to keep open. So that's one way, and there were more challenges in doing that, as we've said before. Pioneers often tend to be intuitive, sometimes can be a bit gung-ho, can be hotheads, can be sometimes tricky people to be with. I think Paul would have been a nightmare to be with. You know, I'd have worked with Apollos, not Paul. So that often is the profile of a pioneering person. That's the, you know, you get the rough with the smooth. To revitalise an existing church, that person also needs to be something of a pastor, something of a diplomat. They need to be able to bring two groups together. So we've got some existing people, the legacy of this church, and then maybe there's some new people that are coming in, and they need to work together. I've got an MA student just did her thesis. She's about to do this, so she did a thesis on what she calls church planting mergers, which is this model, revitalising churches. And she's got a wonderful pastoral heart, and she did some interviews and talked to some people and proposed a model of how that might work. And we're going to try and make it a little booklet that we can give away for free, because she had some great thoughts. But she kind of mapped out the sensitivities of the journey that you need to take these two groups on. One of the things, for example, was it's vitally important that you acknowledge that this church that's closing was probably once vibrant, and that needs to be acknowledged. It's not saying this church has failed. It's saying this is a church that's had a vibrant history. At this point in time, it is like this, but that's not the whole story. We want to celebrate the whole story of the church. And in some ways, we want to touch back to whatever the glory days or the founding days were of that church through this intervention. This is not a shaming story of you failed. New people will come in and rescue you, and they'll be the heroes, and you'll be you need to leave or take a minority role. But somehow we need to bring together the bigger story of this parish and reimagine what it might be. So church planting can be a particular way of doing that, of revitalising declining churches. Fifth, church planting enables growing churches to multiply. All growing churches eventually plateau. No church continually grows. And there are size dynamics around numbers of people in the room. You'll intuitively know that. There's a dynamic of a meeting in your home where you can see everyone's eyes, you know everyone's names, you feel connected in a relational way. There's a difference between that and up to a group of 50 or so, where you recognise everyone's face, but you might not know everyone's name. Have you heard of Dunbar's number? Dunbar was a researcher. He suggested that human beings are wired to be able to maintain about 150 acquaintances. And so maybe there's a Dunbar's number for church, a St Dunbar's, that says, a church of 150, you might just feel like, yes, we're acquainted. And then when you get beyond that, the church starts to feel more like, oh, it's a crowd. That matters in terms of churches that are growing. I remember at G2, a couple that left about a year and a half in or something like that. And I couldn't work out why they were leaving, and I arranged to meet up and had a chat with them, and they told me the story. They just said, we joined this church because it was so loving and caring, and just feels like we don't know people anymore. And I thought, well, that's true. You joined when we were 12 people. You knew everyone. So of course it felt just automatically loving and caring. Everyone knew your name. Everyone said hello to you every time you came. And when we get to 50, you just feel like, I know their face, but I don't know who they are. But that's what a room of 50 people feels like. A room of 100 people feels differently, etc. So a growing church has two options of how it can grow. It can either, the leadership can either adjust to move into the next culture. But the observation is that that takes more work than you think. What we imagine it involves is we need a few more chairs, turn up the volume, some more service books. That's how we get bigger. But actually what you have to do is lead the church through that culture of, we were a group of 50 where we knew each other's faces, and we're now growing into a church of 100 where you'll come each week and you won't know everyone's faces. My wife and I used to be in church for about 700-800 people, and I've been there 2.5 years, and I was still having stewards say, hello, are you new? And that used to really annoy us. But we just had to say to ourselves, it's a big church, it's okay. It's not their fault that they don't know our face and they think we're new. It's a big church. That's what you get in a big church. You get the benefits, but those are the challenges. So church planting offers an alternative, which is instead of continuing to grow, the church can multiply and plant out a group. I've got friends that lead a church in Loughborough who said to their church, our vision is to be a church of 200. And what they mean is, as we grow up to 200, we'll be talking about church planting. As we get to 200 or just over 200, we're not just going to keep growing and, hey, let's be 500 now, let's be big. And there's always something in an ego of a church leader that often wants that sort of growth story. Their vision is as they grow above that number that they feel is right for them, they will see that as that this is the trigger for us to do the next multiplication. Yes, sir?
Do you mind if I ask how, once the church has grown out of that context and seeded a new church and so on, how they then relate to each other? Because when I think about our Anglican context, it's about the mutuality of relationship, the collegiality between colleagues across congregations. How does that work in this context?
In that instance, this is a free church, but they are a network. So the plant remains in the network. So I think there is an implication that the new church is part of this network and family of churches.
Therefore not founding itself as another independent church, therefore, but remaining close to the church that seeded it.
Yeah, I think so. And yesterday we looked at what some values might be of a mix and ecology, and implicit in that is that there is a relational connection that endures. We're not just saying this is the new church that we don't speak to again, and it's separate. So church planting offers an alternative to growth, which allows churches to multiply. And I think it's possible to multiply at lower numbers than we often think. So we planted G2 Central, the video that you saw, when we were 80 people. And I remember Josh used to keep asking me, do you think we can do, when should we do this? And I remembered I felt like I was stalling, and I was sort of saying, mañana. Next year, we'll have a bit more money, we'll have some more people, we'll feel a bit more settled, we'll have done some more planning. And I realised what I was doing is I was just deferring, that we would never be big, we would never feel big enough to do it. And I realised I needed to pull the trigger and say, no, we can do this now. We can be 80 people and we can plant out, I think it was 8, to start that next congregation. It's also interesting to note that act of giving away seems to be incredibly life-giving. It's counterintuitive. It's a bit like feeling full of energy after you've been for a run. It doesn't make sense, does it? If I want to have energy, then I should preserve it and not expend it. But actually, in our physical bodies, when we invest in it, it's as if we get more back. And I think the same is true in churches. In that sacrificial act of giving to the apostolic mission, what actually happens is it re-triggers revitalisation within the congregation. It sort of naturally draws something out. Christian Selveratnam's research, which is quite old now, it's from the 80s, the natural church growth research, he guesses that every 5 years churches will start to stagnate in their culture. You will just become inward looking, and your missional impulse will sort of fold in on itself. He thinks every 5 years a church needs to do something that will reset that, and planting something out, even a small congregation, would be one way of doing that, of resetting those values of what are we committed to and how do things work here. Just a few more. Church planting brings fresh innovation to dioceses. Church planters are typically younger, often more recently trained, often more entrepreneurial. They're often more willing to take a risk or to do things differently from existing church leaders. They may have connected more widely, picked up ideas from others that they're willing to try. They may be more willing to try ideas that others haven't tried. Within a diocese, a new church is a way of incubating and testing new approaches. It's a way of having a bit of an R&D going on without risking the main network. Recognising we do need to explore some new ideas, but we don't yet know with confidence which are the new ideas that we need to be fully embracing. Well, those can be tested out in new initiatives. New initiatives can be a place of cultivating innovation. When we started G2, often, everyone has suggestions. People had suggestions, and we felt early on, I think this was a really helpful thought, that there were many other good churches in our city, so we didn't need to reproduce or to try and reproduce the styles that they did well, because that would mean we're just simply competing with them. Our commission was to try experimentally other forms of church that might complement the whole mission of God in the city. So for us, that was, in the beginning, that meant cafe-style church. No one had done cafe-style church in our city, so we did that because that wasn't being offered anywhere else. We didn't know what would happen. We didn't know who would feel connected or not to that, so that was an experiment. It was a place of innovation. Actually, in time, others came and visited, saw what we did, and thought, oh, that's a good idea. Well, we might start a cafe-style thing. That might work in our village or our context. And so that's a natural way that ideas can be tested, multiple ideas can be tested, and then the ones that fare well can spread through the diocese for others. Church planting brings ongoing renewal to dioceses and existing churches. The points we've noted already, if you like, offer something to the diocese, but the reception isn't automatic. But if a diocese is willing to be shaped and influenced by some of its newest forms of ecclesial mission, then that energy, that enthusiasm can spread. Like we said about evangelism, that if a new group is afresh, putting its focus on mission, and if we communicate that and celebrate that and receive that well, then it sort of stimulates something in you. That's just it's a natural process, isn't it? Have you ever had a friend put a post and say, I'm going on a fitness drive, and you sort of think, yeah, I think I should go on a fitness drive as well. And so it's just that dynamic. If you're in a family, if you're in a network, if you're in a group of relationships, then the benefit that someone is finding in part of the network can spread, can be received. And I also think there is a default decline mentality in every institutional church, because before we were ever involved, our denominations were in decline. That has to be a very subtle, powerful thing that has affected the narrative in our head and in the way we speak. And what I see in my context is often we theologize, we develop theology to describe what's not working. We have a theology of decline, because then we feel better about it. And so church planting can subvert that by saying, actually, some people are finding faith over here. Maybe we could see some of that. Maybe that might trigger something in us. Often in church planting, a team is involved. And so sometimes initially the churches that are established already might seed the new initiative by finding and encouraging people who can be part of the team. But then the evidence is that over time, actually new churches attract people, and the people they attract, some stay, and others migrate back into the longer established churches. And they bring with them a sense of renewal. And over 5 years or 10 years, that can have a tangible effect. So G2, I felt we had a season where we were just particularly effective at helping people who had burnt out. They'd just burnt out in a village church, they'd just taken too much on, they'd crashed. They came to us. The fact that it was different just gave them a way of connecting, if that was refreshing, because it was just different. They had some space to kind of, reset and recenter. And then in time, they'd come and tap to me and say, "We're so sorry, Christian, we're leaving. We're going back to our local village church." And I was a tiny bit sad and quite a lot delighted. I thought, that's brilliant. I think the kingdom's game. And it makes obvious sense that you would be involved in the village where you live, rather than driving all the way over to us. And it's not really cost us anything to have you involved, and you've contributed here. And so it has a net impact that spreads through the network. There is a danger of models that produce transfer growth. So we do find that big launch church plants always attract transfer growth, and I think that's just something about the model, and that is often criticised in my context. So the HTB church plants that launch with 500 people, fireworks and balloons and pizza ovens, and that's all fantastic, but that inevitably attracts people in churches who think, "Oh, this looks much better than this crew we're involved in. Let's go over here," and that can have quite a negative effect in those. We've noticed over time, then often there's quite a significant drift back as well, but it can have a negative effect on the churches that are there. Sorry, I've lost my page. And then last, church planting, sustained engagement with church planting in the diocese can produce a fresh, a new culture of multiplication. There's a point at which addition can become multiplication. Those that study this suggest that we've got examples of this in history, and there are clear examples of this in nations that are developing, but there are very few examples in Western Christianity. Would you say Western Christianity? What would you say? Yeah. But in the common culture we share. But there is early evidence that we're starting to see some of that in new networks. So, for example, the HDB network, which began with that one in the St Peter's plant, that's now a self-perpetuating network, and we've got plants that are down to the 4th generation, and we're starting to now see the 5th generation. So it's moved from an addition, a sequential planting, to something that's got viral qualities. None of us need to have a virus explained to us in this day and age, but it's worth noting at some point one person had COVID, and they blessed the whole world. And that person did not visit each one of us individually. It spread through multiplication. So there's a dimension of mission that's multiplicative, that's qualitatively different from a sequential or an additive program. And it's something about beginning with a sequential, doing parts, that eventually there's a trigger, there's a shift in momentum, and it can reach a point where it acquires an energy of its own. I'll finish with this. I've started to do a little research on movements, and as I said, many of them are historic, many are in other nations. I've got a friend, Theo. He died sadly at the beginning of this year. He was a fellow student when I was studying, and a very unassuming black South African man. And my tutor said to me, "You should meet Theo. He's planted 82,000 churches." I said, "So, typical response, really?" Yeah. So he said, "Yeah. Before we admitted him to a program, we hired a private detective just to check. If you just wanted to verify, was it just a made-up thing?" And the report was, "Yeah, it's probably about true." I met Theo, very unassuming man, and asked him his story. Incredible story. He was working in finance or something like that, and one night he had a dream, and in the dream he saw Jesus, and Jesus said to him, "Start planting churches in villages across Africa." So he gave up his job and started doing that. He quickly adopted a very simple model that hardly changed at all. They would go into a village, sing, find the common place. The singing attracted people. They'd get people to join in with the singing. They would preach and then pray for people, etc. And they would repeat doing that. And then in time, some would come to faith, and they would baptize those that came to faith. And they would train people to memorize Mark's Gospel. He said they were often working with people who were not literate. They were just simple farmers, etc. So they would train them with Mark's Gospel. Theo said to me, "Christian, when somebody's learned a third of Mark's Gospel, they're ready to plant." He said, and either way, within 3 months, we would expect them to be planting into the next village. You can see how that spread. Now, there's a myriad of questions with that, the quality of what's going on, but clearly it was unbelievably effective. And none of these churches were big. I don't think any of them were over 50. But however you do those numbers, there are several million people involved in that. And Theo tracked all these on a spreadsheet, but clearly he only planted some, but it became a movement because the ones that planted the next and planted the next. And what we've learned in church planting is often the most recent church plant is actually the community most likely to do the next church plant. And that if you can foster that, that sort of feeds and stimulates the movemental dynamics of what's happening. Anyway, let me finish with this. Seven qualities that we've observed in these movements that begin to self-perpetuate church planting and the spreading of the gospel. The first is they usually have contagious evangelism through the local church. And probably I'd add with that, confidence in the gospel. I don't know in my nation if we are confident in the gospel. I think we're timid in the gospel. And I don't know if we're contagious in our evangelism. And I think we often assume the minister will do that for us. And at best, we might invite people along, and maybe even that has faded in recent years. Movements typically have contagious evangelism that's taken place through the local church. Second, they tend to have fervent prayer for an encounter with God and for mission. Churches that are growing and movements that are growing pray fervently. One of my reflections, having been a free church minister and having been for longer an Anglican minister, is in the Anglican church we hardly pray. We think we pray, but we don't. We actually spend time writing reports, having synods, debates, and voting. And it almost feels as if our strategy is, when we vote it, it will be done. When I was a free church minister, and I became an elder, and I started being involved in what the ministers did, I realised they had an incredibly simple structure. They had hardly any meetings. But what they did have is 3 times a year, all the leaders met for 2 days of prayer and fasting, and it was full-on Pentecostal style. And we would clock up about 16 hours of prayer, and all the agenda of our common life was filtered through prayer. Things that weren't working, we prayed for them. Things that were working, we thanked God and we prayed for more opportunities, wisdom that was lacking, what was needed. All these things I learned were processed through prayer. And as a young minister, I just sort of learned, we'd get together, we'd pray about some things, and we'd come back the next time and they'd say, we prayed about this, it's happened, and this one has happened. This one not yet, so we're going to keep praying about that. We've got some more things. And I learned that's how you move the dial in the kingdom of God. You get down on your knees and you pray, and you feel like, I haven't got anything. I have no idea how this is going to happen, and I don't even know if we could do it, but I will pray and I'll see what's happening. And I do wonder, in my context today, if we are praying anywhere near what we need to be praying, the level of prayer, in order to see what we hope will happen. And a reflection on leading G2, the church that I was leading for a decade or so, is actually our greatest breakthroughs did come when we had seasons of prayer. And we did 24/3, we did a 24/7, we'd do half nights of prayer, we'd do prayer weeks, etc. We'd do all sorts of things. And it was often after those that new opportunities and ideas and things began to develop. Third, movements have locally adapted methods but a shared vision. Okay, that's a subsidiarity point that we mentioned before. Fourth, movements have discipleship systems that develop and release new leaders. I haven't got slides for it. Fifth, movements focus on the poor, the marginalised, and the minority groups. And it would be very easy to overlook that, especially if we're trying to work out how we can fund or resource things. And Paul, when he met the Jerusalem Council, that they said to him, remember the poor, and he said that was the very thing I was eager to do. Anyway, that was the only requirement they put on him in his proclamation of the gospel. 6, movements empower both men and women to teach, evangelise, and lead. Probably more clearly, movements empower women to teach, evangelise, and lead. It seems to be a key point that when women are activated in their ministry, churches thrive. Now that might be particularly true in context where the leadership role is seen as a male role, and that might mean there is a diminished participation amongst women. You think of, for example, Wesley. Wesley trained the common man. He reached the common man, but he made him a leader as well. And Wesley did the same with women. So he broke 2 taboos of his day. And I wonder which of those, I don't know, but certainly his elevation of women, his affirmation of women, that they will teach, they will lead the small groups, they can be evangelists, they can lead these things in the grassroots of the church. They weren't necessarily like the pastors or the ministers, but activated as trusted ministers to do the gospel work of the church. Then through the activation of women, these groups begin to thrive. And the last and final point is that movements are visionary churches and networks with leaders that equip and empower others. It's easy to have different views of leadership, but I think when leaders see their primary role as being there to equip and empower all the saints, that's when movemental multiplication takes place. Thank you. We'll stop there. I'm over time.
What was the fourth point?
Hang on.
Discipleship systems.
That release new leaders.
I'll put all this in some slides. That's the only thing I didn't put in slides. Number 4 was discipleship systems that develop and release new leaders. Yeah, I'll add that as a slide, and I'll send the PowerPoint round in case you want any of the quotes.
It's now morning tea time, and then back here at 11 where we have the